Hi, Dr. Jim Turrell here to talk to you about the second part of the 100 series. This is 102, The Nature of Effective Prayer. And this is class 9 in the series of 16, but it's also class 1 in the series of this class called The Nature of Effective Prayer. Now, to understand prayer, we have to understand this word called consciousness. And consciousness is sometimes difficult because most people see that word as defined as what's going on around us. But what we say in this teaching is what's going on within us. So it's very important that we monitor that inner sense of ourselves as much as that outer sense of ourselves, and that we learn to communicate with that higher power that's called God or Goddess or the higher power, whatever you want to call it. So it works like this. We have this sense of ourselves, which is basically an effect, which means that we feel that we're basically subject to the circumstances and conditions of the world, and we really don't have a lot of power, so we turn to manipulation and gamesmanship. But when we discover that in fact there is a higher power, that this cause that's in the world could in fact help us, it gives us more of a pixelated sense, as in this picture below, of ourselves as perhaps having a greater sense of hope that we could perhaps change things. And then we find that we have a mentality, which in fact communicates between cause and effect. And that gives us a sense of persona, much like this picture fills in with color. And that persona gives us a sense of presence in the world, but maybe perhaps we do have some power to operate with. But soon we discover that mentality itself is bifurcated, has an inner and an outer part, which makes that sense of ourselves seem more like a mask than a truth, much like this picture is a mask that we wear. And then we discover that objective, or that outer sense of ourselves, has a demanding sense of it, which tends to make our lives more hardened and demanding that life be what we need it to be or want it to be. And then we discover that inner part in moments of, when we're susceptible to experiences, when we find that we have a memory, and then we feel either guilt or shame or a desire of loneliness. And that sort of throws a veil over us, much like this picture below. But when we get into this teaching, we realize that in fact there's a principle inside of us, and there's a receptive part on the outer part of our being. And when we turn to that principle then begins to turn that phased out sense of ourselves with a little more clarity in who we are. And then that receptive nature even adds more clarity until we then bring that receptive principle, turning our demand not upon our memory, but to create a greater idea of ourselves. And that greater idea then manifests as a much more defined sense of ourselves. And that's the purpose of the class, to use prayer to bring both the inner and the outer part together. So the principle is functioning in a receptive fashion, or we're functioning in a receptive fashion to that principle, that the demands we make upon life heal our memory, not make our lives more difficult, but in fact make our lives easier. So let's get to work and studying what Dr. Ernest Holmes said about this. Today we're discussing your relationship to the spiritual universe, how we reenact the nature of God, what we've learned, and freedom, and punishment and reward, and spirit, soul, and body, and limitless medium. So let's get started. We reenact the nature of God. Whatever is true of the universe as a whole must also be true of the individual as some part of this whole. You are evolved from the universe as a self-conscious thinking center of living spirit, and as such you must, in your nature and being, reproduce the universe. This does not mean that you are God. It means that in your small world of individual expression, your nature is identical with God's. We must expect to find in ourselves the same inherent attributes that we find in the universe from which we spring. I love this quote: "A single drop of water is not the whole ocean, but it does contain within itself the same qualities and attributes." You and I are made out of and from life. As effect must partake of the nature of its cause, so we must partake of the divine nature from which we spring. We did not create our nature. We cannot change its inherent reality. We are what we are, and we use this nature for better or for worse. Because we have choice and volition, or initiative, we also have the possibility of bondage. But our bondage would be our choice, not God ordained. The science of mind makes a tremendous claim that we should be free from the bondage of sickness, poverty, and unhappiness. This is a tremendous claim, that in fact we're reproducing this universal in our own inherent small world. and that bondage is in fact a choice. But most people would say, I never chose to be in bondage. I never chose to be limited. You're right. But that inherent nature within you sort of has a memory of observing other people doing the same thing. And thus we buy into it, totally unaware that we're accepting that life seems to be limited, and it really isn't. And that we can use prayer to change our minds. Let's read on. We've learned all we can from suffering and pain. There could be no divine intelligence that could wish for you to be sick, suffer pain, be unhappy, and end in oblivion. If God is absolute good, there is no way he could ordain humanity to be anything but a perfect expression of life. Suffering is not God ordained. We create it in our own experience as we individualize the divine. By suffering, we mean self-choice and complete freedom with the power back of our creation. We cannot imagine a mechanical or spontaneous individuality. We come from perfection, but we must find it on our own. So here's the key. Here's the key. You got to discover this stuff on your own, which is why you and I are studying this stuff on a regular, continuing basis, because it all matters. Because while we say that pain may be mandatory, suffering is optional. We do not have to keep suffering from any shame or pain or guilt or anything like that. We can, in fact, use the power within us to change our minds about who we are and how we want to live in this planet. Now, I know it sounds unusual, but this is the thing that makes spontaneous healing possible, because once we get it that God is completely working in concert with our belief, we can change that belief and instantaneously heal things. I know it sounds crazy, but it's done all the time. Freedom or bondage? We therefore arrive at the conclusion that while bondage is an experience, there is a reality to which bondage is not real. To be able to think and dream of freedom would not be liberty. A prisoner under a life sentence can do that. To imagine without the power to manifest such imagination would be to remain in a dream world which would never come to self-realization. This is not the world in which you live at all. For your world is one of self-expression. Even though this expression appears to limit us, we are an infinite mind, and infinite mind is also in us. It is by this mind that we think. This mind is eternal, therefore we are eternal. This does not alter the fact that our potential is just as perfect as is the inherent God. The only way God can evolve a spontaneous individual is to let him or her alone and allow him or her to awaken to themselves. On the road to self-discovery, we must be subject to the law of reality, and if in ignorance we violate this law, we must thereby suffer. Suffering may be salutary in that it leads us to a place where we learn that it's unnecessary. We shall cease to suffer as we comply with the laws of the universe. Pain is not an eternal reality. If this were true, we would have a suffering universe, a suffering God, an agonizing deity, all of which is untrue, unreal, and impossible. But you and I both know that there are times in our lives when we feel like this is our pain, our unhappiness, our fear is never going to end. But somehow or another, it does end. It ends because there is something within us which knows how to right the ship. You know, if you're sailing in a sailboat and you get knocked down and roll over, there's this thing called the keel under the boat, which automatically rights the boat in most cases. And when boats get righted, it means that the boat has an ability to bring itself back upright. We're all capable of that. But the whole point is, why should we let ourselves get knocked down over and over again till we realize that's unnecessary? We just learn how to have to sail the boat a much better way. Read on. Freedom or bondage, part 2. If you take your images of thought only from your previous experiences, then you continue in the bondage of which those previous experiences create. If we talk about discord, we shall become more discordant. The more the world arms for war, the more certain it is that there will be war. People who spend all their time talking about their unhappiness become more unhappy. Eventually, we shall understand that all human bondage is an invention of ignorance. We do not say that you cannot sin. What we say is that you do sin or make mistakes, and you are thereby automatically punished as long as you continue to make the mistake. There is an immutable law of cause and effect that says we are not punished for our sins, but by them. The age-long discussion of the problem of evil will never be answered until we realize that evil is not a thing of itself. It is simply a misuse of the law of freedom. The problem of evil must be met only to the degree that we cease doing evil and do good, for evil will disappear when we no longer indulge in it. When the whole world sees the right and does it, then and not until then will the problem of evil be solved for the entire race. It is necessary that we understand the unity of all life, the unity of God and humanity in all three planes. It's pretty amazing that we're making this decree that says evil is not a thing of itself. It is a reality in the sense we keep practicing the same mistakes over and over again. I remember I went through a period where I used to believe in this idea of don't get mad, get even. And I used to get even all the time, but I never realized that was a core belief inside of me until I decided to change it. And when I discovered it, I was really embarrassed that I believed that and think that. But I was operating under that belief because I saw others doing the same thing. When I no longer indulged in it, I was much freer. I was free to finally let go of enmity between myself and people I thought were my enemies or people who I thought were against me. The moment you do that, you rise to a much higher level of operation. Spirit, soul, and body. Studying humanity, we find that our body, like the physical universe, devoid of mind or intelligence, has no volition. It may be permeated with intelligence, but it is not intelligent. It is one with the body of God, the physical universe. The objective or conscious mind is the spiritual mind for which we have been looking, but it is not fully developed. If this were so, there would be no mind with which to look. The objective mind must be the spiritual mind of humanity, since it is the only thing about us which knows that we have life and is conscious of itself. The doorway to the Absolute, or to God, stands open at the center of our intuitive perception. We enter the Absolute through that which appears to be finite, because the finite must be drawn from the infinite. Now, before we go on to the next page, I want to just, draw a little understanding about this. What Ernest Holmes is saying here, of course, is that outer part of us is something that's fully aware of what's going on, but it's not fully developed. To develop, which means that we have to become better at loving, being peaceful, more harmonious, more truthful, and seeing beauty in all life around us, and expressing a greater degree of freedom. Freedom not from fear, but freedom in principle that says that we're expressing a life that's greater than we've ever expressed before. But we have to develop this. That's why we're in this class. And the doorway to that power, which is the Absolute, or the presence of God itself, the cause of all life, is something we enter into through what looks like the finite, which means we have to go to the door, which is finite, and open the door to see that this that we think is blocking us is in fact just a temporary, I emphasize, temporary condition. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's illness or finance or relationships, it's temporary. And you got to remember that, because you're moving forward and you're moving into a greater expression always. The spirit of each is equipped with decision, will, choice, volition, intellect, and purpose. It is the microcosm within the macrocosm, which means the little world within the big world. The spirit of each seems to have an external and an internal perception. Its external perception is by appearance. Its internal through intuition. Appearance would limit the future possibility of each to the uses we have already made of life, and thus circumscribe the infinite, hence judge righteously and not by appearances. Plotinus tells us of three ways we gather knowledge: science, opinion, and intuition or illumination. Science is spirit inducing its own law. Intuition is spirit knowing itself. Opinion is our estimate of reality. Oh, I just love this particular group of words. Because then Plotinus, who is this Neoplatonic philosopher who lived around 400 AD, made this amazing discovery that if we could look at life scientifically, we would begin to induce life differently as we discover the laws of life, like gravity and electromagnetic energy and stuff like that. We can use it for really good things. But intuition is the spirit knowing itself. And when we know ourselves in a much deeper, richer, more meaningful way, then our estimate of reality, which is our opinion, really changes. It shifts dramatically. Dramatically, because we're not here just like on an ego trip saying that we're going to be better, because we're not comparing ourselves. We're just realizing that we're emerging, not developing in such a way to compete, but emerging in such a way where we lend, give back, contribute to the world. This is what great art does. This is what great understanding does. This is what great philosophy does. It gives back to the world. Moving on. Spirit, soul, and body. Continued. To suppose that one must retire from the world to be spiritual is one of the greatest possible mistakes. This is directly opposed to the self-evident truth that spirit enjoys itself only in its own works, which is its self-manifestation. We enter into the spirit of life only as we enter into the spirit of living. There can be no real enjoyment of life until we see that everything is animated by the spirit. And as we see that things are thus animated, we are beholding the real universe. Karma means the law of cause and effect. Soul contains the memory because it is the receptacle for the seeds of our thought, and because it is the seed of memory, it contains our inherited tendencies. It also contains the race suggestion. We're not dealing with a separate or isolated subjective mind, but with one subjective mind. Now let me just take a moment to comment on what I just read to you. What Ernest Holmes is saying here, of course, is that this mentality, this thing that connects us with cause and effect, is in fact all part of this subjective nature of ours. But we have the objective capacity to change our mind about who we are in the subjective world. But we can't change what others have thought into that universal or that memory that seems to be a part of who we are. And that sort of ebbs and flows, moves back and forth until we realize we don't have to learn how to change that. We just need to learn how to operate in it so that we don't become of it, but we utilize our power to translate that, convert that energy that might be negative into a more productive idea of living. The soul is the seat of memory, the mirror of mind in the individual. It is the creative power within us, creating from the patterns given it and from the memories it contains. We gather soul or subjective force as we accumulate the right kind of experience. The law of soul is subject to the conscious spirit. Tendencies set in motion in the soul, or subjective life, tend to produce their like in the objective world. From this is deduced the possibility of the healing power of the spoken word, operating through mental law, for the law of mind is always subjective. Memories as a whole constitute the subjective tendency of the individual life. This tendency can be changed with a determined persistency of purpose. Ha! What a great idea. That memory that was within our soul and those tendencies which we're born with because we observed our parents and the adults in our life doing things in a certain way, we didn't consciously get it, that we're imitating that until we say, I don't want to do that anymore. And then when we say that, we can deduce a whole new way of living our lives. It's not enough just to say, I don't want to do that anymore, or to blame them for their own level of consciousness. We have to, in fact, consciously decide. And that's that wonderful part of prayer that says that we declare our word right now. And we speak our word with a persistent sense of a higher purpose, then we change those tendencies and we just literally heal ourselves from that memory. Very important thing to do. So the sum total of all erroneous human belief binds until the individual mentality lifts each person above the law of averages into the higher law of spiritual individualism. Now this is something you're going to discover in this teaching. There is this thing called the law of averages which people operate under out of ignorance until they lift themselves consciously into a conscious desire and intention to live life differently. And that's what changes all averages, when enough people decide that they're going to be loving and peaceful and not offensive or defensive, that they're not going to be involved in taking away, but adding to, that they're not going to be judging people, they're going to be validating people. It all changes, it all makes a difference. Spirit, soul, and body continued. Body, effect, affairs, conditions, health, disease, destiny, riches, poverty, business, vocation, profession, results, any word which stands for the externalization of humanity's thought and endeavor, we class as a part of the body. Our outward life is a result of the subjective state of our thought. The thinker is conscious mind, but when we think, we let fall the forms of our thought into subjective mind, which is the universal medium of all thought and action, and as a result of this, the creative medium at once sets to work to produce the thing outlined. Plotinus, that famous Neoplatonic philosopher, said about nature, I do not argue, I contemplate, and as I contemplate, I let fall the forms of my thought. This is the manner in which nature creates. It contemplates. Thus, whatever we think, good or bad, falls into the universal creative medium, and unless neutralized, tends to take objective form. So, here's how it works. We're starting out with a universal conscious mind or spirit. And that conscious mind is the thinker. It thinks about itself constantly. When it thinks about itself, it creates the context through which it can manifest form, all of this figure. So here's the thinker thinking, and as it thinks, it sows, and it sows those thoughts, and those thoughts fall into and are planted into that soil. Now we say the soil is the universal subconscious. It's also known as the soul. And those seeds in that soil are simply waiting to turn into things. Like the soil turns seeds into plants, our subconscious turns our ideas into experiences. But here's the key. The soul cannot reject what you believe or think into it. It can only take the form that you give it. And that form could be, in fact, toxic, or it could be creative. You have to decide that, because you are that individualized power of God that individualizes the universal as you become the thinker. And the result is always some particular experience or growth. All experiences are unconscious effects and have only the meaning we give them. So if all we can do is focus on the toxic nature of life rather than the creative experience of life, then all we're doing is putting out forest fires and trying to clean up messes, when in fact we want to be planting whole new ways of living life. So it's important that as the thinker thinks, it sows. Spirit, soul, and body continue. There's no difference in the ultimate minute particles which take innumerable forms. Only difference is the arrangement of the atoms. Our bodies are one with the whole body of the universe. Seeds, plants, cabbages, and kings are all made of the same primordial substance, which is forever flowing into form and forever flowing out again into the void. Nothing could give form to a formless stuff, which has no mind of its own, but some intelligence operating through it. Here, then, we come back to the Word as the starting point of all creation. God's Word is the great creation, the great world, and humanity's Word is the small world. One spirit, one mind, one substance, one law, but many ideas. One power, but many ways of using it. One God in whom we all live, and one law which we all use. Our body is really one with the body of God, with the physical universe, but body does not know it is body. If feet knew they were feet with the physical capacity to walk, they might be cut off and still be able to run down the street on an errand. It is one thing to say that feet do not know they are feet, and quite another thing to say that they are illusions. Yet all are agreed that they have no intelligence of their own. We're talking of feet, of course. Of itself, the physical universe is an effect. So it is with the physical part of the humanity, which we call the body. Now, I know it's sometimes a stretch to pull this all together, but here's the way it is. When we're dealing with this physical body, it is an effect, and the only meaning it has is what we give it. If we stop giving meaning to our body as if it was designed to be disease-ridden or designed to be limited, and we started giving meaning to our body and to the body of our affairs, that they were in fact unlimited possibilities, a greater expression of love, a greater expression of peace, we would have a completely different experience. Body is not the illusion, but it is the form, and that form has a cause, and that cause within us is defined by how we define it. That's why it's very important for us to define our life as a constant idea that something good is emerging. That's expectancy, which we'll talk about as we go. This limitless meaning, when we realize that in dealing with our own individuality, we're dealing with self-conscious mind, and we realize that in dealing with subjective mind, we're dealing with universal subjectivity, we shall come to understand that we have a creative intelligence at our disposal compared with which the united intelligence of the human race is as nothing. The universal subjective mind, being entirely receptive to our thought, is compelled by its very nature to accept that thought and act upon it no matter what the thought may be. That means our internal subjective mind is the same as the universal subjective mind. So here's the thing. The thoughts become things. When you think into life in a negative, non-productive, sort of mean-spirited or defensive fashion, then you create the form of that as a possibility. So here's the three things that you have to know about this whole possibility. Number one, limitation is not in principle nor in law, but only in the individual use we make of principle. Our use is determined by our individual capacity to understand it, meaning understanding principle, understanding law. Then we can make a better use of it, and that's what prayer is all about. We cannot demonstrate beyond our ability to provide a mental equivalent of our desire. Now those two words, mental equivalent, means a greater picture, a greater vision. It's kind of like when we do treasure mapping and we create a map of what we really want, things that are greater than what we're currently experiencing, but we have an internal sense that we forever, for whatever reason, that's intended for us. So moving on, we come into this world with a subjective tendency toward conditions, but we must not forget that we are also dealing with a subjective tendency toward ultimate good. In spite of all conditions, the race believes more in good than in evil. It doesn't matter what may be the subjective state of our thought. The conscious state can change it. This is what affirmative prayer does. Affirmative prayer is consciously knowing that there is no inherited tendency toward limitation, no race suggestion operating through subjectivity, nothing in, around, or through us that believes in or accepts limitation in any way, shape, manner, or form. Additionally, we provide a higher contemplation, a spiritual realization which says, I partake in all good, surrounded by everything which makes life worthwhile. So prayer can change our lives. When we consciously recognize the presence of God in that first step, and then we unify with it, and then we use that principle to guide, direct, and manage our affairs, then we give thanks for the outcome as if it's already so, and then we release the word because we don't want to hang on to the word. We want that universal power to let that, to interact with life and let it grow into a greater expression. So the reason that we do not demonstrate more easily is that the subjective state of our thought is too often neutralized by the objective state, though often this is an unconscious process, which means that inner part of us is sort of overwhelmed by that demanding outer part of us that's fearful, limited, and unhappy. But we have to turn to that greater principle within and pull forth a sense of not hope, but a sense of knowingness, of confidence, of consciousness. And when we create that consciousness where we're no longer living in fear, it's like those wonderful words that says that love, perfect love, casteth out all fear. We get rid of our fear through love. Here's an affirmative prayer. God is the universal consciousness forever creating out of its own intelligence perfect love, abundance, and peace. My life is a microcosm of God's infinite good, forever creating my experience and feeling of love, abundance, and peace. In this moment, I'm completely blessed by God's perfect love, declaring that love to be my love in action. I accept God's perfect abundance and peace. My creative nature provides ideas, vision, guidance in all that I do, say, and think, and proactively initiate. My word is law, and my life is now functioning on a higher and higher level of acceptance. Thank you for all my good and all my blessings. Daily I feel the gratefulness of a full and joyful heart. Released, my word is now my experience. I surrender to the universal consciousness of God's complete creation, and so it is. And here's some wonderful affirmations. I'll say them first, and then we'll say them together. So, number 1, God is with me now in all I create, heal, and bless. Together. God is with me now in all I create, heal, and bless. Number 2, in this moment I personalize the creative intelligence of God's brilliant idea of unlimited good. Together. In this moment I personalize the creative intelligence of God's brilliant idea of unlimited good. Today I am the outpicturing of a great and grand idea of creative abundance in action. Together. Today I am the outpicturing of a great and grand idea of creative abundance in action. Right now I am God's agent of love and distribution point of peace. Together. Right now I am God's agent of love and distribution point of peace. Joyfully I accept a greater good than I have ever experienced. God is good. Together. Joyfully I accept a greater good than I have ever experienced. God is good. This is my moment, and this is my opportunity to know the truth and be free. Together. This is my moment, and this is my opportunity to know the truth and be free. And finally, God bless all that I touch, see, think about, and know. Every person I meet is blessed with a feeling of love, peace, and abundance. Together. God bless all that I touch, see, think about, and know. Every person I meet is blessed with a feeling of love, peace, and abundance. Well, there you have it. That's the first part of understanding prayer. And as we go through those prayer journals and we understand how to use them, we will recognize the presence of God's love, unify with that presence, declare it as the operating principle of who we are, give thanks for it, and then let it go. That's the power that we're talking about. That's the nature of effective prayer. God bless.